So if this is our statement and we're comparing it to this statement, that's these two right here, they have the same exact truth values. Okay? So that means that since these are identical, the statements A and the negation of A are indeed equivalent. And you would write that as A is equivalent to the negation of A. Okay, I kind of want to get through this quickly today so you have time to work a little bit on 3-4 because we're not going to spend too much time. We're going to go right on to 3-5 tomorrow and right on to 3-6 when we're done with that. Yes?
What is like the equal sign or the three? Like,
this just means equivalent. Yes. All right, so are there any questions on equivalent statements? Yes?
How did you know that the last one was true or false?
Because here you're negating the previous column. So if it's false, it goes back to true, and true goes back to false.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Page 2. All right, so let's look at this scenario. All right. So here, let's say I offer you a deal. If you have at least a 95 on homework, then you will get a 2% bonus in the course. Okay?
Is that true?
make it true.
So the question is, if you get a 95%, would you expect to get that 2% bonus? Yes, right? Absolutely. If you did your end, then you expect to be rewarded that 2%. Okay? Now, if someone does not get the 2% bonus, what would you expect? If I did not give somebody the 2% bonus, what does that mean? Exactly. So they did not get the 95% on homework. Okay? So what we're going to do right now is show that these two sentences are the same, logically. Okay, so let's say P you have at least a 95% homework average. Let's call that P. You will get a 2% bonus. Let's call that Q. Okay. So then when we fill out the truth table, again, here are your scenarios. True, 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 false, false, true, false, false. Okay. How do you write if you have a 95 homework average, then you will get a 2% bonus? So that's P with the arrow and then Q. Okay? And we've studied this already.
Yes.
When is this false? That's probably the easiest way to remember it, right? True, false is false. Otherwise, everything else is true. Okay? So that's the first part of the statement. Now what we're going to do is translate the second one down here. If someone did not get a 2% bonus, so that would be negation of which one? Q. Then we're saying they did not get, so that's negation of P. So that's what we're trying to build up to. Okay, obviously we need P, Q. This part is like normal. And now here, we need to negate both. So I'll do negation Q, negation P. Okay, and let's fill out this truth table. The negation of Q, if we're looking at the Q column, you just reverse all those. So that's false, true, false, true. Negation of P, go back to the P column. That becomes false, false, true, true. And now for our final column, if the negation of Q, then the negation of P. So that's looking at this column, the first, and then the second one here. And again, it's an if-then statement. So the only thing that's going to be false is which row? The true-false row, right here, the second one. Everything else is true. So right here, final column, since they are identical, okay, so let's go ahead and fill out this bullet point. Since the final column of the truth tables are identical, the statements if P, then Q, and if not Q, then not P, are identical or equivalent. Okay, and so we would write this as an equivalent statement using that notation. And now this brings us to our first definition of the unit. Okay? And that is the contrapositive. Okay? A contrapositive is basically taking a conditional statement and then flipping the order and negating both parts. Do you guys see how we did that here?
Yeah.
The P and the Q switched, but they were both negated. Okay? So that would be negation of Q, then negation of P. So this is called the contrapositive. Okay, you need to know that. So when you see this statement, if you're asked to find the contrapositive, you just flip them and negate them, and then rewrite the if-then sentence.
Is it only in the if sentence?
Yes. This is this exact case. Yes. Okay. And hopefully this makes sense because up above we kind of reason our way through it already, right? If someone says, if you have a 95, you get a 2% bonus, okay? Think about the contrapositive being, well, if they don't get a 2% bonus, then what does that mean? That means they didn't get the 95 to begin with, okay? So, and those have the same truth values, all right? So what I'd like for you to do right now is take a minute or two and write the contrapositive of A, B, and C in complete sentence. All right, I'll do the first one since we've already done it. The contrapositive. Now we say if you did not get a 2% bonus, then you did not have a 95% average on homework. Okay, that's the example we started with. Okay? Let's see. All right, Chase. How do you write the contrapositive for if you live in Chicago, then you live in Wisconsin?
Well, I did if you live in Chicago it's C, and then you do not live in Wisconsin is W. Negation W.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I did W, arrow, and negations.
So how do you write that? I think that's correct. So how do you write that as in
Oh.
words? Yes.
If you live in Wisconsin, you do not live in Chicago.
If you,
Sorry, I just go like above and beyond sometimes.
you sure do. So if you live in Wisconsin,
You're Wisconsin.
then you did not, or you do not live in Chicago. Okay. Very good. Andy, what about C?
So it's like flip, so it's like surgery would be necessary.
So if the surgery is necessary,
Yeah.
then what? All the tests came back. Well, they're already coming back negative.
Oh,
There we go. Flip and negate. Okay, you just got to remember that. Whenever you're asked to do the contrapositive, you flip the halves, you flip the P and the Q, and negate both parts, whatever parts are given to you. Okay? And using that same formula, okay, if you look at this example here, you're not writing out a complete sentence, you're just writing the contrapositive of the symbolic version of the statement. So if you flip these and negate them, now what comes first? R, the if-then symbol, and now what comes at the end? P or Q. Okay? So this is what it looks like. If this is what we start with, here's what it looks like, which is kind of what Jason was doing in the...
What did I say?
This whole thing is considered like your P before,
Oh,
and this whole thing is like your Q. Does that make sense?
okay, so the whole thing would
Yes.
be negation in the front.
Yes.
So now it's
Now it's just not negated at all. Right. Okay. On to the next page. Last page of notes today. Okay? And then we're going to put all your homework up on the screen and see where everybody's at. Okay. So some of the problems that you'll see, like on the exam, you guys, might look just like this example, different sentence, but very similar to this. Okay? So you might be given two statements, and one of the things that we might ask you is to prove that they're the same or to prove that they're not the same. And one way you do that is with truth tables. So take a minute or two right now and show why or why not, well, it tells you they're not, but show why these are not the same, okay, using a truth table.
Hey, look. Get off my back last turn.
like not equal, so you do the equal
Oh my
sign
gosh.
and the diagonal line. Would you do this?
Regular math. This is still math.
You know what I
I know.
Are we getting math with numbers?
I think we had a line. Who needed to go?
Bro, I like that.
Oh, I need to go.
Thanks, that's not.
Can I join that?
Who needed to go to the bathroom besides? You can go first, and then you can go when he comes back.
Should I go
After Philip, yeah.
Can I go after Kyle?
Sure.
Because I need to go. It's a joke.
Okay. So here's what it should look like. Hopefully these don't take you very long to do anymore. So both are set up the same exact way. And if you're not using the same order I am, like I said, I'd prefer that you did, but if you're not, you need to make sure that these are identical to what you have here. Okay, because if you're looking at the last column and your rows are flip-flopped somewhere, you're not going to have the same thing necessarily, and you might need to. Okay, so you need to be careful. All right, so this one we've talked about being false only when it's true and then false. Here we negate P. Here we negate Q. Same thing with this one. This if-then statement is only false when the first part is true and the second part is false. So that's this row, the third one. Everything else is true. So right here you can see that these have different, some of them are the same, but they all have to be identical. And since they're not, okay, then we say that if P then Q is not necessarily the same as if not P then not Q. And the way you would write that is exactly the same as before, but now you put a little slash through those three equals, or the three lines. Okay. And this, by the way, is called the inverse. Okay, so for the inverse, I'm going to go ahead and write the definition down. The inverse is you just negate both parts. Okay? So there's three things that you need to get out of this today. One is knowing what the contrapositive is, and knowing that that is logically the same exact thing as its original sentence. But now there's these other two. The inverse, we just showed why they're not exactly the same. So, but if you're asked to write the inverse of something, here's how you do it. You just negate both parts. Okay? You don't have to do any switching or anything like that. The converse, though, the converse is where you switch. So if we have P then Q, the converse is just the reverse. No negating. Okay? So all of these sentences that we've learned today, or all these equivalent statements, they're all based off of the conditional statement, right? This is all we're looking at is conditional statements today. One out of the three are always the same, the contrapositive. The converse, not necessarily the same. And the inverse, not necessarily the same. Okay? Let's look at example 5, and then we are done. Okay, so I'll just go through these. If you live in Chicago, then you do not live in Wisconsin. For the contrapositive, you flip and you negate. Does that make sense? So now you would say, if you live in Wisconsin, then you do not live in Chicago. That's the contrapositive. And you know, it's kind of easy to remember it, at least in my opinion. This is the biggest word that we're learning today, and that's the one where you do everything. You flip and you negate everything. These other two, you just do one or the other. Does that make sense? For the inverse, you're not flipping anything. You're just negating both parts. So for the inverse, instead of if you live in Chicago, what should it be? If you do not live, good, in Chicago, then what? Then you live in Wisconsin. And right there is a great example of why you would say that the inverse is not necessarily true, right? Certainly, if you live in Chicago, then you do not live in Wisconsin is a true statement. So certainly the contrapositive is the same. If you live in Wisconsin, then that means you don't live in Chicago. Okay? But look at its inverse. If you do not live in Chicago, does that mean you have to live in Wisconsin? You can live anywhere else, right? So that's a good example to illustrate why the inverse is not equivalent to the original if-then statement. Okay, the converse, last one. So here we flip and negate. Here you just negate. Here you just flip. Okay? So the final sentence would be, instead of if you live in Chicago, we would start with if you do not live in Wisconsin, then you live in Chicago. And again, you can see right there why the converse is not necessarily true. Because if you do not live in Wisconsin, it doesn't mean you must be a Chicago resident. You can live anywhere else besides that. Okay? All right. Are there any questions